What about the New York Times? It's the same. For the New York Times, it's also the same. I always say this. I say this all the time. Okay? There are obvious institutional biases when it comes to mainstream outlets. Okay? There are. But even, what do I always tell you? Even when the New York Times writes an article, they don't directly lie. Okay? They don't. They don't just like make shit up. They'll just go to a resource that lies with regular frequency, Israel, okay? And they will just say, this is what Israel said about the attack. That's not a lie. That is literally true. Israel did say that about the baby annihilation that took place. That's the problem. New York Times is not going to fucking lie. They're going to bury the lead. They're going to use passive tone when they're talking about like Palestinians being slaughtered, and they're going to actively spike a story if it looks really bad for Israel, and they're going to do everything in their possible power to make it seem like Israel is actually simply forced to do something violent, but they're not going to just make shit up. They're not going to just fucking lie. They're not going to make up a resource. They will go to a source that is not credible at all, the Israeli envoys, the Israeli government, and they will say it as though it's they will report it as though it's like a reasonable narrator of events, when they have shown time and time again that they're not a fucking reasonable narrator of events. But that's still like a lie by omission is still a lie, but it's not a lie in the same way that like these contracts are real. Okay. And if the New York Times was reporting on this story, they would also go through the process of like looking at the contracts. Do you see what I mean? If the New York Times was reporting on this and it's like Brian Tyler Cohen wasn't Brian Tyler Cohen, but it was Israel, for example, they would just take what Brian Tyler Cohen is saying and put it in the article. That wouldn't be a lie. He did say that, right? They would request a quote from him, and then they would put that quote in the article. Even when someone is lying by omission or laundering or just whitewashing the reputation of a person, they're still in a mainstream resource, in a mainstream report. They're not going to just like make shit up. Okay? And ironically enough, I try to explain that to you guys all the time, and sometimes I feel like I maybe have failed in describing this process to you. Well said. And the way the New York Times lies and also informs how they occasionally put out excellent work. Yes. Yes, they don't make shit up, but they quote people who make shit up, and then their readers take that as truth. There's hardly a difference. I know, which is why I always explain that to you. But there's a difference between completely making shit up and going to a person you know makes shit up. Ultimately, there is still an editorial standard that they're abiding by. As a matter of fact, the New York Times' reporting on Screams Without Words was the October 7 like mass rape directed by Hamas news report did not meet the editorial standard of the newspaper. That's why it was a massive fucking issue, because internally, New York Times reporters and even the editorial staff was actively yelling about putting out this piece of report that was filled to the brim with false information. That's why it was a huge fucking deal. It was a bigger deal than all of the other reports that they've conducted, where they just like go to Israel and Israel says, no, the baby's crib was Hamas and there was a Hitlerian artifact inside of the baby's crib, and then they just like slam that into the middle of an article where they're talking about how Israel lasered like 50 children. Okay, like that's the difference. The difference is like you can't just like go and make shit up.